Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I'm Hunter Ohanian. I'm the director of the Stonewall National Museum and Archive here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. It's about 127 degrees here in the shade. And I'm going to put the AC on simply because if I don't, I might melt away to nothing. But I want to welcome you all here this evening. We have a talk with Lisa Sigel. Lisa, say hello.
Hi.
Nice to see you, and it's great to meet meet you this evening. And also, I want people to say hello to my colleague Paula Sierra. Hello, Paula.
Hey.
Nice to see you. So Paula will be behind the scenes this evening, and she'll be making sure that we're all on the straight and narrow as we go through the next hour of this conversation, and trying to help us out with any technical things that we have. And so if you're just joining us, welcome. If you're on Facebook, we're very happy to have you here as well too. And we have about an hour to talk. And so to give you a little bit about the procedure, we ask that people throw their questions and comments into the Q&A or the chat, and we will get to them as we go along. We try to leave the last 15 minutes or so for discussion, but sometimes we actually bring the quick questions up as we go along, because it really is a good conversation. And I know that many people do listen to these things as podcasts, and we're going to be doing some visuals. And so that's difficult to do if you're just listening to it while you're doing your workout or at night or something, but take some time and look at some of the visuals as well, because this is going to be a somewhat visual heavy talk that we're having this evening. For those of you who don't know Stonewall, we're one of the oldest LGBTQ archives in the United States. We're located here in Fort Lauderdale. And in our library, we have 28,000 books. It's believed to be the largest LGBTQ library in the United States, if not the world. I'm not quite sure who keeps track of those things, but it might even be the largest queer library in the solar system, as far as I know, but it's possible. But there are certainly a lot of books. And in addition, we have an archive, and the archive was started probably about 25 years ago. And in the archive, we have 2,700 linear feet of LGBTQ materials going back to roughly 1950 to the present day. And so when I first came there, 2,700 linear feet didn't mean a lot to me, but what that actually means is all the way up one side of the Empire State Building and all the way down the other. And it totals about 6 million pages of contemporary American culture through a queer lens. And so we're home for researchers and writers and the general public, anybody who wants to come and see and study and understand what our parents' lives were like, as far as being part of the other, but also what future generations are going to look like as well too. We did a nice talk and tour today with the Bass Museum here in Miami Beach, and of course there's a lot of similarities and overlap there, and so that was great. So if you're in the South Florida area, we are open every day. All of our COVID restrictions have been lifted. And so we have 2 exhibitions up right now. One is called Don't Ask, Do Tell, which is the history of the relationship between the US military and the LGBT community, going all the way back to George Washington's time and ending with Joe Biden's time. And it's really fascinating to look at that whole history, where you see that except for a small sliver of time during the Obama years and now presently during the Biden years, there's always been this fractured relationship between queer people and the military, even though they say there are 65,000 open gay men and women and trans individuals who are serving in the US military. So it's a fascinating look at that. And it's also a nice understanding about politics as well too, because you get to see how as presidents came and go, things flipped and flopped a lot as well too. Also, we have a show called Off Our Backs, which is looking at early lesbian publications from 1950 to 2000. And what I find really interesting about that exhibition is, again, taking items from the archive. The curator of that show, Megan Kent, really compared the difference between men's magazines and women's magazines in the LGBTQ world. Men tended to fetishize themselves or objectify themselves and their peers, where women were definitely looking at much broader, more sensitive issues, sexual autonomy, oppression, building community, political power. And they're all topics, of course, that now many men are trying to catch up with these days. And so it's those two shows are really quite a nice juxtaposition. If you have things to donate, we bring in donations probably 3 or 4 times a week. People mail them to us. They bring them to the library here in South Florida. The website where you can find everything that you want to know about us is called stonewall-museum.org. You can sign up and you can get our weekly newsletter there as well too. We just received a big grant from the Mellon Foundation, and so we're going to begin the process this summer and fall about beginning to digitize a lot of our collection. And so that's really very exciting as well too. So I think that's everything about us, and so please come visit us. And so, Lisa, let's get to you, because tonight is really about you, and it's about this book called The People's Porn. And I heard about this book because somebody left a review either from the New York Review of Books or the New York Times on my desk, and they said, Hunter, you should interview Lisa because she would be a great person. So I ordered the book for the library. It's still in our news section, as you can see here. And so it was a great read, but welcome, happy to have you here.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so where are we finding you this evening?
I'm in Oak Park, which is right outside of Chicago. It's home to the most Frank Lloyd Wright houses in America.
Right.
I'm not in a Frank Lloyd Wright though.
And you teach at DePaul?
Yes, I'm in the history department there.
Yeah. And how long have you been teaching there?
I've been there for 20 years now.
Wow.
Yeah, I've worked my way up. I think I'm one of the few people who was an adjunct and is now a full professor.
Yep. So teaching undergraduates, graduates?
Just undergraduates. We have only a very small master's program.
Yep. And what are you teaching these days?
I teach research methods. I actually love teaching research methods. And I think that at some level, this book was inspired by my work with teaching undergraduates how to do research. So I do research methods classes. I do Victorian England, World War I, European women's history, the history of sex. I'm sort of all around. Yep.
And so how did you fall into this particular part of history? There's obviously a lot of history out there. How did this human experience sort of rise up to your interest?
So when I started undergrad, they were still teaching courses, and it would be 14 weeks on a topic, like 14 weeks on Victorian England, and then 1 week on women, if you were lucky, if it was a progressive instructor. And there was very little discussion of gender or women's lives. So I got deeply invested in the history of women. And from there, I began to think about sexuality. A lot of what they basically taught you was about prostitution or marriage. Those were pretty much the only topics that were well documented at the moment. And I grew interested in trying to capture the idea of fantasy and how one could explore fantasy over time, how what goes on in people's brains changes over time. So I was drawn to pornography as a source that would let me do that. I never really thought I would become a historian of pornography, but 30 years later, that's what I am.
And so when you were 21 years old, what was your relationship with pornography? I mean, was it like, I don't mean to be intimate with that question, but was it very arm's length? Was it something that was abstract, or was it something that was real to you when you were sort of developing as an adult?
It was not the same pornography that you have now. It was not on computers. It was, if one wanted pornography, one had to go out and get it. Whereas today, as far as I know, pornography is ubiquitous. It's on people's phones, it's on people's living rooms. So I think everybody's experience with pornography was quite different. But then again, I'm quite old.
You're not that old. But, we all come to it. And again, I think about millennials or people who are young enough or old enough to be our children, and to think that they have a relationship with pornography. And the only common thing that I would think of is that my sense is that as you and I might not have talked about it, they don't want to talk about it as well. There is sort of, and again, even the term that we're using, pornography, and I want to talk about the terms as well too. There is this off-putting idea that human sexuality, something that we all know where we came from, something that we all see our gender and our sexuality every day, but yet there is this huge divide between culture and how we actually get into that particular space on a daily basis, and how it gets ostracized, and how the art world or the academy treats it in so many ways. It's an amazing phenomenon.
It is, and it's, we might think that the stigma against porn ended a long time ago, but it really hasn't. There's still no money for grants to research pornography. I had a big show at the Museum of Sex in New York, and I proudly brought my kids, and I just wanted to take a picture in front of the poster that had my name. And we went in, and it was like the first floor of the shop, not at the exhibits or anything. And they hustled us out so fast. I mean, they threw us out the door. They're like, you can't have kids there. And I'm like, but that's my show. And they're like, no, you can't have them. So there is this real stigma around pornography and around the representation of sexuality.
Yeah, and that's a good point. I'm happy that you said that. And using your own children as a way of talking about it. So folks, just so you know, we will be showing some images and talking about things that might be sexually explicit. And if this might be a trigger for you in some way, I want to give you some kind of warning now. But what we're really talking about is a cultural and an art form and human experience. And so I've asked Lisa, don't pull any punches. And so really, let's have a good conversation about it. But if you don't think you're prepared for it, that's totally fine. And but it's difficult to actually edit this stuff down. And also, FYI, I'm one of those people that I'm the last person to put some kind of warning up in front of the Mapplethorpe show or anything else. I'm simply not, I don't think that's what history or art should do. I personally don't think there should be warnings about education. And so I think that's on a parent to understand whether or not their children or their family members are prepared to take certain things in. As somebody who runs an educational institution, I don't think that's my job. My job is to present honest stuff out there. So if anybody's offended, okay, I'll say I'm sorry. I'm not particularly sorry about it, but the point is just we'll have the conversation that we're going to have, and I feel like I've given everybody the warning that they need here. Do you want to add anything to that? Do you want to disagree or agree?
No, I just want to say that I'll be showing some slides of some images, and there are erect penises. There are sexual acts that are portrayed. So I've tried not to include any slides that people would find dismaying, but.
So be it. And so, all we have to do is say that erect penises will show up, and then certainly viewers will go up through the roof anyway, which is a whole other issue as well too. Mm-hmm. So you did a few books before this one, but so as you thought about this book, as you thought about the people's porn, as you and I were talking about it before, there are a couple of avenues into your research and what you're doing here. There's certainly the sexuality. And again, I'm going to keep on trying not to use the word porn because I think it's too loaded, even though I know it's in your title, but I think it's a very loaded word. But so you want the reader to think about it in a couple of different ways. You want them to think about sexuality, and you also want them to think about artistic production. And you also want people to think about being an outsider or being somewhere else in which they are somewhat separated from what we might think is sort of mainstream cultural production as well too. That some of the makers of this work are not necessarily individuals who have skills that are part of the canon that would be approved by the schools of fine art from a European tradition in the 18th century, and certainly an American tradition from certainly the 1920s and 30s and 40s in this country. And I know you approach this as saying you are a historian and not an art historian. And you're very careful and you do it wisely to say, I'm not looking at this from an art historical standpoint. I'm looking at this from a historical standpoint. But so you bring people into the conversation in these different ways. So what was that process like for you? How did you find those different avenues? What is it that you want us to take away from it?
It was a slow process of building basically an archive of materials. It started with a single pamphlet that I saw 30 years ago, and then I went back to and thought about what can I do with this document that has no provenance. There is no author, there is no date, there is no place, but it has a very vivid sexual universe embedded in it. What can I say about the world of sexuality from this one person's vision of what he wants his sexual world to look like? So I went to the archives and tried to find other pamphlets. And from other pamphlets, I went to handmade objects and illustrations and paintings and carvings, and it just cascaded. So thousands and thousands of documents later, I'm at a point where every time I give a talk, somebody brings up an artist or a sort of material that I've never heard of. Yeah. So I feel like I've documented an archive, but there are other archives that are out there that need to be built.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it almost by definition in the work that you're doing, that's going to be the case in the sense that so many people are off the radar. They're making this work because I think, and disagree with me if you will, but they're driven by a couple of things, by either a creative desire or a desire to explore their own sexuality or express their own sexuality in some place. And so they may not be skilled in particular ways that we think of creative production being, but they're taking whatever skills that they have in order to mash those things up. I mean, some of the stuff where you're talking about 18th century stuff, I'm sorry, 19th century stuff, some of the areas where you're talking about what is happening in prisons, what the people are actually making. Some of the work that you talk about, the fact that sailors in the 19th century, you know, carving whale tusks, and the idea that those guys out in those boats were making erect penises, having sex with somebody else. I mean, you know, if it was 1825 and I was a sailor on some boat, you know, for 4 months killing whales and had nothing to do at night, I'm not sure the first thing that would dawn on me would be carving a hard dick and having sex with somebody. But this is what they were looking at. This is what they were thinking.
They were producing art, and this is an area of art that people cared about. Yeah. They made all sorts of illustrations, and they did all sorts of things with whale teeth and sea ivory.
Yep.
Yeah.
So I know that you prepared a PowerPoint, and so maybe we should go to that. And then that might give us a way of having some more conversation on the other side of it.
Sure. I'm just going to warn everybody here that I am a historian at heart. So even though I'm not wearing tweed right now, I have figurative tweed on. So when someone says, give a talk, I'm like, yes, I have the formal talk, and the glasses go on. So here we go. I'm going to share my screen. Okay, there we go. So I'm giving a talk today on my new book, The People's Porn. It's my 4th book, notable not only because it doesn't have a naked lady on the cover. Wait, why am I not getting to my naked ladies? There we go, my naked ladies. Because in all my previous book, the publishers all picked naked ladies because that's emblematic of pornography, but also because it uses an alternative body of records, homemade and handmade pornographic objects. This book historicizes erotic pamphlets, drawings, scrimshaw, soap carvings, wooden toys, fiber arts, and more, because these handmade objects tell us something important about the past. These objects tell us about individuals' desires. They tell us about how people understood sexuality and what they could visualize. They tell us about the materials that people found around them and how people could refashion them. This book argues that even more than other types of antique objects, handmade and homemade pornography allows us to understand the past from which it came. And I make this claim knowing it sounds hyperbolic and grandiose. However, handmade and homemade pornographic objects reveal a history for periods when sexual artifacts have been ransacked and destroyed. In many cases, handmade and homemade pornographic materials might be the only artifacts left by their makers. They're also intensely human, with all the originality and flaws that that entails. Historians have been looking to understand the history of American sexuality. One of the central tasks is to understand how American sexual culture developed from African American culture, from Native American culture, and from European culture. Helen Lefkowitz Horowitz, in Rereading Sex, suggests that we look at the sex manual, Aristotle's masterpiece, as the central document of vernacular culture. That volume, first published around 1690 in Europe, had a long publication history before it began its circulation in early America. Many versions had been published in the 18th century. It was a favorite to pirate amongst printers both in England and the United States. This booklet provided basic information about sexuality. However, the popularity of the volume should not be equated with its vernacularity. It was still the product of commercial production. And if it informed the populace, it did so under the rubric of neoclassical erudition. I think that Horowitz looks at the wrong starting point to consider vernacular sexual culture. Instead of looking at what people bought from printers, we should turn away from commercial products and look at what people made out of wood, metal, bone, and paper. To do so, we need to confront the categories into which sexual objects have been sorted. To some, just the term pornography implies a certain ugliness. Some people might think that scrimshaw or even soap cultures should be categorized as something other than pornography in order to recognize the artistry of the makers. These objections recognize that to label something as pornographic has real consequences. And let me just say, I have lost job offers, funding, grants, and other opportunities because I work on pornography, so I know what those consequences are firsthand. The impact of—
Lisa,
Yeah?
I'm only seeing a blank white screen right now.
You're only supposed to see a blank.
All right, thank you. Okay, just want to be
like, oh no, she lost job offers, and just be like so like moved by that. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry.
Okay, good. The impact of labeling something as pornographic goes back for centuries. Walter Kendrick explained that the term pornography first emerged to describe writing about whores. He noted that the term pornography doesn't name a thing in and of itself, but instead it implies an argument. Thomas Waugh extended Kendrick's claim and noted that the distinction between erotica and pornography almost always is based in class and gender or gender bias, or else in the historical myopia of homophobia, cultural snobbery, political instrumentality, or personality. My erotica is your pornography. Thus, the labeling of objects as pornographic versus erotic remains arbitrary. Historians have skirted this issue by recognizing the contingent nature of such definitions. Instead of seeking a universal definition, historians recognize that objects like a novel might have been understood as pornographic in the past, even if we do not look at it that way now. And as I go through my presentation, remember that sense of contingency. Some objects became labeled as art while others did not. If we only focus on those objects that fell into the bucket now labeled porn, we will have an impoverished vision of what pornography meant in the past and what it can mean in the present. If I could if one could write a comprehensive history of American pornography, commercial pornography would no doubt swamp homemade and handmade pornographic artifacts. However, the complete story of pornography in America cannot be told because of seizures and prosecutions that have destroyed the ability to know the past. Few examples of pornography remain from the 19th century, thanks in no small part to the zealousness of anti-porn crusaders. Anthony Comstack and others destroyed books, illustrations, photographs, pamphlets, rubber goods, typeface, printing plates, and even business records. By 1913, Comstock bragged that he had convicted more than 3,600 people, enough to fill a passenger train of 61 coaches, each holding 60 people. According to his own records, he destroyed 160 tons of obscene literature.
And just to interject here, people need to look at the Comstack Act, and it was passed by the Congress in the late 19th century, and it was really it was an attempt to rid culture of perversion. And in many ways, it was meant, the perversion was meant to go after gay people at the time. Certainly it was meant to go after straight pornography, but this was a way of quieting down conversation and communication between gay people, that as the society moved moved away from agrarian to more urban areas, they wanted to actually stop the communication from happening. And this was considered a major part of the language that they spoke.
And they also went after any information about birth control. So it was about intervening in women's ability to control their own sexuality and fertility.
Absolutely right. So, you know, the sexism and the homophobia was really, you know, they were just hand in glove at the time as those things happened. And again, this was an act of the U.S. Congress and so the way they went about it with the Comstack Act was that they stopped people from being able to send stuff that individuals wanted to between two consenting adults through the mail, or being shipped into the United States government, or being shipped into the country. Anyway, sorry to interrupt.
It's all good. So even this policy continued, the obliteration of materials. During the 1990s, the FBI incinerated its extensive collection of seized objects, including films, magazines, and pictures as well. As Elizabeth Haven Hawley states, writing a cohesive narrative with so much of the historical record unrecorded or destroyed seems an impossible task. As a result, we can't identify the first American pornographic novel. We know that soldiers looked at pornography during the American Civil War, but we don't know what they looked at. We don't know about 19th century American collectors or collections. While it's important to understand the large-scale destruction of commercial pornography by anti-vice crusaders and understand the way it limits what we can know, historians nonetheless have overlooked the corpus of handmade and homemade objects that those crusaders never found. Activists could not find homemade and handmade materials because these objects circumvented the market and stayed out of the public realm, the area most vulnerable to discovery. Thus, these objects remain scattered here and there, overlooked and relatively unconsidered. This provides a new view of pornography. In general, scholars look at the commercial market and they see problems produced by commercialism. They see pornography as highly industrialized. They focus on mass-produced materials and make claims about pornography producing a sexuality that's plasticized and commodified as a result. As Gail Dines and Robert Jensen wrote, pornography is the industrialization and commodification of sex, and like all big industries, its product is generic, formulaic, and plasticized. Further, they treat commercial pornography as if it affects its users in some sort of straightforward way. There are innumerable problems with this model, from its understanding of the trade to the ways that it conflates production with demand. Historians have not been able to differentiate demand from supply and have instead assumed that the pornography that people bought was the pornography that they wanted. Without letters, memoirs, autobiographies, and other documents, how can historians detail reader demand in the past? Gaps in the archival record make it impossible for scholars to answer basic questions about how people used pornography in the past. Who used it? Were they male, female, rich, poor, black, white, old, or young? How did they read? Did they read quickly or compulsively? Did they identify with the male characters, the female characters, or both? Did individuals choose pornographic materials to meet their fancy, or did they make do with what they found? To begin to untangle some of these questions and address the issue of demand, my book uses homemade and handmade pornography. Handmade objects allow us to consider the desires of their creators rather than the marketplace. Because there is no intermediary between creator and object, amateur materials provide a more direct view of personal sexual desire. Objects show us what people wanted to see by providing a shortcut around the commercial market and state control. More than just providing a backstory to the emergent present in amateur productions, these homemade and handmade pornographic objects can show us the range and diversity of desires in the past. As much as the world might want to limit sexuality to the realms of the uplifting and transcendent, handmade and homemade pornography reminds us that we are imperfect in both body and mind, subject to pain as well as pleasure, willing to laugh at ourselves and each other, and moved equally by the ridiculous, violent, and sublime. And with that, I am just going to go and start showing you some of these objects. These are a couple that are culled from my book, and some of them were not in the book. They came to me after the book was already in production, so I couldn't include them. But I was so delighted with them, I thought I'd show them here. Right. So these are coins. They're Liberty Head coins, and the one in the bottom right, you can see the little Liberty Head. They're produced from 1812 to 1849. The Kinsey Institute has a collection of these altered coins, and you can see someone, and I think many people over time, took off the E and put a U on it so that it read the one cunt coin. And what I love about these is that I can just imagine people in the 19th century with coins in their pockets, walking through lives, jingling these around and having this joke that they carried with them. This is one of the scrimshaw objects that you had mentioned. This is the front of it, and it's the picture of the boat that the man was on who made this. It's the HAS Morgan. And on the back of it, it's hard to get a scrimshaw because it's a three-dimensional object, but hopefully you can see it. It is a naked woman on a sea monster's head. And I love this because I think it's a really beautiful rendition, and it captures the idea of seafaring. This is a ring, and it's quite magnified. It's actually a hand-sized ring rather than like a napkin ring. And it's a nude figure. And what I find interesting is that there is no hair on this person's head. So it's, for me, I read this as gender ambiguous because there are very clearly breasts and absolutely wonderful little navel that you can see on the right-hand slide. But it is not marked out as a deeply feminine or masculine object. And here you can see the real care that's being given to the pubic hair, which I find just amazing. And then to think that somebody could wear this and like have it obscene and the obscenity on the inside or the outside, depending upon the circumstance. So this is a Lincoln figure with an articulated penis. Apparently there's a plate that you remove and then you can have the penis pop up. There you go. This is from Kirk Landauer. So after the book went to print, someone told me about a Washington. So Lincoln wasn't the only president. There was a pair of andirons with Washington with an erect penis as well. And if you want to talk about any of these, you can leap in at any time.
I have my order in for the Donald Trump andirons with the erect penis there, just facing the fire though, as opposed to facing outward. So anyway.
Yeah, that would be great. So this is a pamphlet, A Pretty Girl's Companion and Guides to Love's Sweetest Delights. It is hand drawn, hand lined, hand lettered. It is entirely handmade. And this is the one that I saw 30 some years ago and thought, what could I do with this? It is really evocative. It seems like it was made by someone who had been to New York, because in the middle of it, they mentioned Kahn's Museum, which was in New York in the 19th century. So apparently he had heard of it or had been through there. And it's very interesting because we think of people in the 19th century having an impoverished sense of sexual possibility. But whoever created this, it talks about sex with boys, sex with girls, sex with dogs, sex with a group of people. It talks about how to look for cankers. It talks about position. So clearly this person had a really extensive sexual vocabulary.
Yes, and when I saw these drawings in your book, of course, I felt that this was somebody who had to have had a degree of sophistication, that there had to have been some permission that she or he had by being part of some kind of educated field to be able to write things like sucking his sweetheart's cunt with this beautiful little drawing and then these amazing stories. This is not somebody without education or exposure. This is somebody at the time, I believe, who had exposure to a variety of urban and esoteric experiences. And even when you look at the position of these two individuals, the way that you actually see the man sort of lounging around with his erection and then sort of out of the corner of his mouth performing cunnilingus on his partner there. I mean, there is a degree of sort of laissez-faire. There is a degree of entitlement that this individual had who made this work. This is not somebody who's not been exposed. This is somebody who knew that he could actually play off of these things.
Yeah, he has an extensive sexual imagination at the least, or probably an extensive sexual experience and sexual past. Although some of his illustrations demonstrate sort of a naivete to his artistic experiences. I think his ideas went beyond his artistry.
Yes, yes, and I would agree with that. Of course, this is a beautiful drawing, and there's some other beautiful drawing. I don't mean to say that whoever this individual was, that his artistry was developed, but he definitely had exposure. It took chutzpah to make this drawing, even if it was only for him. It took chutzpah to make this drawing.
Yep. This is one that doesn't appear in the book, so everybody, I'm delighted to bring it to you. These are little coffin figures. And the one on the right is the man, and he has a very long penis. The one on the left is supposed to be the woman with a vulva and breasts. Coffin figures, you would take the coffin lid up, and ideally they would have springs so that the penis would pop up as a little surprise when you opened the coffin. And there are a lot, this is a folk art piece. There are lots of different versions of coffin figures. So this one is really, I think it's a lovely example, but there's lots of different ones that apparently people made these and circulated them.
And so going back to those, do you imagine that those were sort of like dad jokes? That somebody would be whittling these and then they would be at some kind of late 19th century barbecue or anniversary party, and the dad would pull this out of his pocket and show it to somebody, or early 20th century? Is this a way for people of getting attention? I mean, who was the audience? Even if it was small, who was the intended audience and what was the intended reaction?
I think it's supposed to bring a bark of laughter. I think you're supposed to sort of just burst into laughter and it's supposed to be about life and death. And I wouldn't even be surprised if people didn't like circulate these in homes or at funerals. This is still at a moment where people would make their neighbors' coffins for them. Before there was a large capitalized funerary trade, people would bury their own dead, and they would also produce coffin figures. So I think of it as sort of a sexual memento mori.
Yeah. Yep.
Yep.
They are dad jokes after all.
Yeah. This one is from a logging camp in Maine from the 1880s. And I love this because I think it's really witty. As you can see, she is fingering herself on a pile of books. Yep. So there you go, a joke about masturbating to pornographic literature in visual form.
Wow.
Yeah. This is an articulated figure, or I've heard people call them guns. You move the little lever on the bottom back and forth and they copulate. And there's all different kinds of articulated figures like this with men and women and men and men and mules and you name it. People were really ingenious about making figures that moved. There was someone, he had an erotic whirligig, which was just delightful. When the wind would spin, people would copulate. This one is a prison figure from the Maryland State Maryland State Department of Corrections. What I love about this is that it shows a penis. So lots of people might say it's pornographic, but this is not what we think of as industrialized or plasticized pornography. The guy's face is just too goofy for that. So when we think of prison arts, this is what always comes to my mind.
So there's two things I want to stop you about with this slide, just because number one, it's so charming, but also you devoted a whole chapter to work that was made in prisons. And would it be too simplistic to say that a lot of the pornographic work was simply because it was mostly made by heterosexual men who were denied access to women in conjugal visits, and therefore they were releasing whatever desires they had through creating that work? Is that too simplistic, or was there something else going on?
Well, there are a lot of other things going on. So I can't, so there are men who are in prison who are making pornographic art about other men. So we can't say that it's necessarily just a straight group of producers. There are also what we have that we know is prison art. This was being collected and sent to Alfred Kinsey of the Institute for Sexual Research, the ISR, which later became the Kinsey Institute. When he was doing research, he was encouraging guards and wardens and correctional officers and police to send him as many materials as possible. And he even, there was in some of his letters, the reference to something that he called the hot room. So it seems like he was giving prisoners pencils and paper and crayon so they could document their own sexual desires. So it's not just that men created it because they didn't have access, which is true. That part of the story is true. But it is also that the state at this point wants to understand the criminal mind, and in particular, the criminal sexual mind. And so they're doing everything they can to document that.
Yes, and of course, at that time in American psychiatric study, there was this overlap between the idea of a criminal mind and sexual deviance. And so they were looking for those intersections under the guise of psychiatry or some kind of medical idea to see if they, and also criminology as well too. They were trying to solve crimes and trying to figure out how that was going to happen. But you raised my second question there, which is the Kinsey Institute. And of course, everybody is aware of Kinsey's study in the 1950s, but maybe just to get it in this talk, put the Kinsey Institute and the collection that it has in some kind of context, because a fair amount of the illustrations in your book are drawn from things that you found at the Kinsey Institute. And from a institutional standpoint, they are very important, but yet they're also very unique in the sense that they have embraced a lot of this work that other more mainstream institutions wouldn't touch in the past, and maybe only a few are willing to touch now. So tell us a little bit about the Kinsey Institute, about Kinsey himself, and sort of how this all kind of fits into the bigger historical context.
Well, I could go on about Kinsey and the Kinsey Institute until we're out of time. So you're just going to have to cut me off. He collected everything. He was the consummate collector. He was known as like million wasp Kinsey or something. His original research was on the gall wasp, and he eventually donated 2 million gall wasp specimens. He believed in the total sample, and he wanted to get 100,000 interviews of people about their sexual histories. So he's best known for interviews, but while he was interviewing, he also collected everything he could get his hands on. So they have a very extensive library and archive. They collect objects. If it had something to do with sex, Kinsey collected it and was like, we'll figure out what to do with it later.
Yeah. Yeah. Amazing. And again, to me, I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but my sense is still, it is unusual within the academy of accepted archival, historical, educational, museum institutions in the United States that they embrace this content better than anybody else does.
Yes, that's true. And they have been suffering because of that. So a shout out to Kinsey. If anybody wants to go and donate money to the Kinsey Institute, they're in Indiana, and you can imagine the state legislature's response to having the Kinsey Institute at the university in Indiana. They have been starved for funding for decades, and yet they stay open and they have this magnificent collection.
Yeah, and it's just, I've been there, and it's really sort of, it's amazing. It brings up another topic, though, which somebody recently brought to me, the work of, is it Charles Wharton, and something known as the Atlas of Men. Are you familiar with this work?
No.
So I hope it's Charles Wharton, and hopefully somebody will correct me here, but he was a psychiatrist in the 1930s and 40s, and actually practiced all the way up until the 60s and 70s, that he somehow convinced the major Ivy League institutions that they should photograph every incoming freshman naked. And so Yale at one point had all of these, so they're pictures of George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush naked, and they were done like face on and then left and right, and there, in some cases there would be a blackout over their eyes, and in some cases there'd be some kind of covering over their genitalia. But apparently Hillary Clinton was photographed when she was a freshman at Wellesley. And both she and Bill were photographed as new students at Yale. And so it is the idea that science and institutions can approach sexuality in this particular way. Now, what he was trying to do, apparently, is he was trying to create a taxonomy for the human species. That was his stated goal. But actually what researchers are finding now is that what he was trying to do was actually, by studying the body, the physical body types of all of these incoming students into Ivy League colleges, that one would be able to actually determine by one's physical body type whether they would be a good mate for your son or your daughter, as to whether or not they had the intellectual capacity to bear grandchildren to another field, or to another generation.
That goes back to the 19th century and Cesar Lombroso's attempt to try and root out, the criminal type versus the national type, as he would put it.
Yeah, yeah. It's just the book is
long-term effort.
The book. I'll look it up while you go to the next slide. The book is called Atlas of Men, and I just want to be sure that I have his name right.
Okay. So this is Physique Pictorial, which was a bodybuilding, purportedly a bodybuilding mag that was legion in the gay community in the 1950s. And it was well understood as having a sexual subtext, and that there's a lovely example of it being modified to articulate that sexual subtext overtly. So it shows you how people could read, or how they could read commercial culture as commercial culture became more widely available.
But again, I have to stop you here because, of course, this is something in this period is something that I've studied a fair amount, and so seeing these things are amazing. But what's so interesting about the individual who made this piece is the idea that I assume it's a he, but he is just trying to represent what that magazine was about. Even though there was no hard penis in that magazine, that's what Bob Miser and AMG were trying to put forward. They were trying to put forward as much sexuality as they could. And this person just made a little change. It's like putting a mustache on, some advertisement on the side of a bus or in a subway that really sort of tells who the individual is. This person really wanted to show what that work was all about.
Yeah, and we've all come across things like this where mustaches or eyeglasses or boobs or penises are put on commercial culture or magazines or ephemera. The amazing thing is when they're saved, and you can see from a time period of how people understood them, how people read them in their own language.
So do you know, does this original image exist? Does somebody have this drawing going back to, the 1950s where somebody drew an erect penis on this cover from fall 1954?
So Alta Glamour, which is it's a antique erotica site. They sell it. They had the original, and they might still have it, and they scanned it in. So they actually have a small museum of the really neat artifacts that they've come across.
That's so amazing.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No worries. This is a bottle opener from World War II. It's there's all sorts of trench art that was made during World War I and World War II. And these are pot holders, which some of them were made with animal fur. Some of them used actual pubic hair that was sewn in. So I like to think of this as home ec gone wild.
Yeah.
Because there are so many different versions of these. And every time I've given a talk, someone has said, oh my God, my mom had those, or my aunt would have those. And people tip a little too much on Thanksgiving, and then they pull them out. So someone actually sent me an extra pair of those. They're like, we have no idea what to do with them, and now we can give them to you. And I'm like, okay, I will have all of the pairs of erotic pot holders in the world by the end of this.
Yeah, no, I noticed in the book that many of these were coming out of your own collection, which all I can say is bravo as somebody who put yourself out there to actually collect the work and preserve it. And, hopefully you'll pass it along to some other generation. But
I will. I'm going to give it to, I really only bought pieces so that I could illustrate the work. Yeah. And so I'm hoping to pass them along someday to an archive or a museum. There we go.
Sure.
These are Stephen Ashby. The one on the left, the breasts are actually made of little acorns. And so when you magnify it, that has those tiny little acorn tips. They're just charming. And the one on the right, he's making another joke. She's sitting in a sardine can. So making a joke about women's vulvas. This is from the Sex Doll Polaroid collection, which is displayed at the Alta Glamour site. They actually put me in contact with the owner of the collection. When, you know, people often say, oh my God, every teenager in the world has made porn, then if that's what this is. And in some sense it is. It's the ultimate simulacra, where it's a copy of a copy of a copy, where the original is just lost. And in these, I don't know if you can see, there's tiny little penises and tiny little pubic hair that's been attached. And the entire collection that is the series of Polaroids, there's Barbies, there's Kens, there's even one with Lassie, but Lassie's just off to the side. Lassie's not doing anything. And this one is Very Busy Bunnies by a fiber artist from the 1970s. And this one, which I'd like to end with, it's actually from a peach pit. It is a prison art carving. It is a small monkey, and he has, I'm pointing to it as if you can see me pointing to it. He's holding his erect penis and he's thumbing his nose with the other hand. And I love the idea that this is prison art, that anybody who's confiscating it is going to get the biggest FU back when they look and try and figure out what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
No, it's great.
So one thing that I want to point out, now that we're at the end of this, is that we've seen objects which were created by women, by men, by people of color, by the imprisoned, by the impoverished, by whalers, by loggers. This is a widespread group of people who are creating this art. It is not just commercial culture. And that's the reason why I named this the people's porn, because it really is a representation of the people.
Yeah, and I think it's so great for you to say that, in the sense that a lot of what you've looked at is, while you recognize the existence of commercial pornography out there, in the sense that somebody's making money for publishing it and somebody's making money for performing in it. And of course, there's been a tremendous amount of exploitation, particularly women in the 20th century over this. But this is really work that's been made outside of the commercial sphere. This is work, and again, that's what goes to what we were saying in the beginning about what I found so attractive about your thesis, is the idea that it is outsider art, it's craft, it's folk, it's people just telling their stories. And in many ways, I sort of look at this piece, and not that I am any kind of Mayan expert, but I look at this particular piece and this carving in this peach pit and think that this could be some kind of 12th century carving that was just some expression that somebody felt about their own sexuality, or mashing up sexuality with the tools and with the materials that they had in front of them. And who knows, when he started this, he may not have started with this particular image in mind, but it was a question of his tools and his imagination, and the raw materials that he had lent him to this particular piece. And it could be 1,000 years ago that this piece was made. Yeah.
Although I find it very moving that it's a prison piece, that, you know, what can a prisoner make? What kind of tools does he have? What kind of raw materials? A tiny little peach pit to try and express his idea of sexual identity. And then that's something that can be, you know, shoved in a pocket and smuggled along.
Yeah. And actually empowering him as that piece, which is a bit of an FU to the establishment that he is under the thumb of. And if he's able to walk around with that piece of thumbing his nose to the establishment around him that nobody might know besides him, is incredibly powerful. Well, we've come to the end of our time. It's amazing how fast these things go. What I do encourage people, if you get the book, please try to go to your local bookseller to find a copy of it, because it's absolutely wonderful. And we didn't really touch on it, maybe a little bit with the Polaroids and the Barbie dolls, but you also do a wonderful job talking about how the people's porn kind of moved into the latter quarter of the 20th century. And of course, there's more to be said about it today as well, too, now that we live in this amazing digital world and everybody has got Photoshop on their computers or their phones or anything else, and we can make all this other work out there. But it's hugely fascinating to understand who we are as individuals and also who we are as a group of people. One thing I want to say is that with the Atlas of Men, that author, his name is William Sheldon, and so Sheldon or O-N. And so take a look. It's called the Atlas of Men, and take a look at how he put that stuff together. So Lisa, I hope you get to come to South Florida at some point, because I would love, I know that we have some work that in our archive that would be of interest to you. And so, and the other thing I would suggest is, I only say this because I used to have the perch as being the director of the Leslie Lohman Museum of Gay and Lesbian Art in New York. There is a tremendous amount of work in their archive as well that will, of course, it's both of those institutions are going to come at it from a homosexual standpoint, but some of the primitive work and the stories that they're telling through that work, I think would be very valuable to you for your next project.
I'll look forward to that, and I'm always come through South Florida. I have family in the Keys, so I'm gonna stop by for sure.
All right. Well, so please reach out to me, and I'll put a few days aside for you to spend some time in the archive. And plus, it'd be great to spend some time with you.
That sounds great. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. So everyone, great to have you all here. And of course, the invitation extends to all of you. Come see us at the Stonewall Library. And we're grateful to have everybody here. Let me say a shout out to my colleague, Paula Sierra, before we sign off here. Hello, Paula.
Hey,
thank you for being back here and making it all happen. And I'll see you at the office tomorrow. And so good night, everybody. And we will see you all next week. Thank you.
Bye.